last week we finished up Matthew 21, I believe, but I'm going to kind of go back because what chapter 22 is kind of a continuation of what's happening in 21. In that in 21, Jesus, starting kind of in verse, like I think 23, he continues his conversation that he's having with the chief priests and the elders as he was teaching in the temple courts. And it all began with the question in 21, if you remember last week, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority, was this question that the chief priest asked Jesus. And so Jesus begins his attack kind of on the chief priest and the Pharisees and the elders in 21 with a series of parables. Because remember, he says, by what authority? And Jesus answered them saying, well, let me ask you a question. What authority did John speak from? And they thought about it, and they couldn't think of a clever answer. And they said, we don't know. And it says, so I won't tell you by what authority I'm speaking, what authority I have in doing these things. So here begins his attack. And he starts with the first parable, if you remember, was the parable of the two sons. So Jesus, basically the sons one says, which son did the right thing? The son that said, I will go and work in the fields, but didn't, or the one that says, I won't go and work in the fields, but did. Which one, did the right thing? And the Pharisees answered, well, the first one, and so Jesus compares the Jewish leaders with the unsatisfactory son in this parable, who did not do their father's will. And then after they answered him the first, he says, truly, I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. Okay, so here goes Jesus' attack with these parables. That's the first one. Then he says, now you listen to another parable here. And he tells them the parable of the wicked tenants, and compares them with, basically is comparing them to the wicked tenants of the kingdom in that parable. And so he asks them, after telling them the parable, he asks them, therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And they said, oh, he'll bring those wretches to a wretched end, and their response. And Jesus said, then, have you never read in the scriptures? And he reads, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And I don't know, Kathy, whether we got into that part when you were talking last week.
I think we talked that, this parable is a little bit different in that it's really more of an allegory. Usually with parables, you just look at the overall picture to get the message. With this one, every aspect of it has a meaning. So.
Yeah. And Jesus basically, after telling them and reading this particular passage, which I believe they say it was from one of the Psalms, Psalm 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. He says, therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. And then, excuse me, and then what Barclay tells us is that, talking about the stone the builders rejected, that the symbol of the stone is something that these Jewish leaders and Pharisees would be very familiar with. That they, in Psalms it's mentioned, in Psalms, Barclay says that that the stone really represented the nation of Israel. But it's also and he also mentioned that anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. And he says the chief priest would be very well aware of that particular reference to the stone from Isaiah, 2 places in Isaiah and 1 place in Daniel. And so Jesus, Barclay kind of ends chapter 21 and the information and his comment on the symbol of the stone with Jesus sums up all of these Old Testament pictures of a stone. So Jesus's person sums up all of the pictures of the stone. Jesus is the foundation stone on which everything is built. He is the cornerstone which holds everything together. To refuse his to refuse him is to batter one's head against the walls of the law of God, and to defy him is in the end to be, whoever defies him is to be crushed out of life. So that's kind of where Barclay ends with chapter 21. And so we begin chapter 22. Jesus continues his attack in chapter 22, and he says, Jesus speaks to them again in parables. So if Tom, since Sarah's voice is out, if Tom could read the first reading, which is chapter 22, verses 1 through 10.
Affirmative.
Thank you.
Jesus again answered them in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like the situation which arose when a man who was a king arranged a wedding for his son. He sent his servants to summon those who had been invited to the wedding, and they refused to come. He again sent other servants. Tell those who have been invited, he said, look you, there he is, look you, I have my meal all prepared, my oxen, all prepared. My oxen and my specially fattened animals have been killed, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding. But they disregarded the invitation and went away, one to his estate and another to his business. The rest seized the servants and treated them shamefully and killed them. The king was angry and sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set fire to their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding is ready. Those who have been invited did not deserve to come. Go then to the highways and invite to the wedding all you may find. So the servants went out to the roads and collected all whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding was supplied with guests.
Okay, so here we have now, this actually goes on 3:14 as one parable, but Barclay separates this out, saying these are basically 2 parables. So we're just doing the first part of this parable right now, in 1 through 10. So Jesus is basically comparing the Jewish leaders to these condemned guests here. And had never heard it before. Some of you might have, that this is basically a part of Jewish tradition, that when invitations to a feast were being planned, they sent out a notice to people inviting them, but not giving them a time or a date or anything. They just said, we're going to have a big feast, get ready, we'll tell you when it's ready. Okay. And so when everything is ready, the servants are sent out to summon the guests. Okay, everything is ready. The calf is cooked. Come on over and eat. So the king in this parable had long ago sent out his invitations, but it wasn't until everything was prepared that they sent the servants out. And then all of these people said, I'm not coming. Okay. And I think that reminds us a little bit of what's happening with Jesus here, with the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership. So Barclay kind of says there's 2 kinds of meaning. He gives what he calls a local meaning and kind of a universal meaning to this, that says it drives home what had already been said in the parable about the wicked tenants, that the invited guests who refused to come represent the Jewish leaders, and they had long ago been marked by God and invited to be his chosen people. But when Jesus or God's son comes to the world, they're invited to follow him and they refuse to follow him. So instead, the king invites the world, the people of the world. He goes out, sends his servants out to the street and invites people in, the good and the bad, people who never expected to receive an invitation, are invited in.
But does that mean that Jesus only came to convert the Jewish leaders versus the Jewish people?
Well, he's really kind of speaking to the Jewish leaders right now directly. I'm not sure that he's has the whole Jewish. It's not like people on a hillside, because he's answering and responding directly to these Jewish leaders who are questioning him and his authority. So
I think that's a
yeah.
dual situation. I think he's talking to the leaders, but obviously he's been out preaching to hundreds and thousands.
And there are people who are following him, so I don't think he's speaking of those people, who are, coming to follow him, but the people who, are definitely trying to be against him.
Yeah, I think this is more about the rejection than it is about the people who accept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's the way I look at it.
right. That's my feeling, what I got out of it too. And it says, Barclay says that there's one verse here that really is seems out of place, and that's he mentions verse 7, where Jesus says the king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And Barclay kind of reminds us that Matthew was supposedly written sometime between 80 and 90 AD. 70 AD was when the temple was destroyed. And so this is being written after the temple was destroyed. And it says with the temple was basically plundered. And so that might be why Matthew is adding this little sentence, in there. That Barclay made a comment that if the Jews, and I don't know what you feel about this, but if the Jews Jewish leadership had readily accepted Christ as Messiah, he says they may not have provoked the Roman Empire, who in the end, because of that provocation, destroyed the temple. I never had thought about it not happening. What if the Jewish leaders had accepted Christ? Would he have?
But wouldn't that have been more of a threat because they really feared Christ coming in as a reigning king?
And wasn't it all positioned in such a way that they had to that they were meant to reject him? I never considered that.
Well, then
It's like when we talk about Judas and what he did.
Mhm. Well, there's also a long history of rejection of, like, the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been this long history of.
told his whole life story. So
Yeah.
that was the plan.
Yeah. Jewish leadership's rejection a part of the plan.
It sounds kind of crazy.
Yeah, right. And then
Well, why is it crazy? Jesus kept saying, trying to convince people, this is going to happen to me. I'm going to have to go through all of this stuff and be crucified and killed and raised again. So it was the plan.
I know, but at some level, that's a crazy plan.
Well, yeah. Bill Maher would agree with you.
Barclay kind of ends up this section with saying that this reminds us that the invitation of God is to a feast as joyous as a wedding feast. And we hear the wedding feast and the groom mentioned a lot in the New Testament, or comparison, the metaphor. Things that make us deaf to God's invitation are not bad in themselves. If you remember, when they refused, one person went to their business, and one person went to their home, their estate. You know, so it's not that those going to your home and estate are evil, but that they just went about their normal business rather than coming to the feast and coming to follow Jesus in the end, or to follow God's Son. So it says, when one person went to their estate and went to their business, it wasn't a moral task, that we can be so busy making a living and going about our normal day that we fail to make a life, is what Barclay says. If we refuse Christ's invitation, our greatest pain will not lie in things we suffer, but the realization of the joyous things we have missed. And reminds us that God's invitation is the invitation of grace, inviting these people who had never been invited before, and that grace is, it was grace that was offered in the invitation. So, you know, I think that how do we prepare? You know, it's just, you need to prepare yourself and be ready when God calls you to that feast. They apparently had been told they were God's chosen people all this time, but they weren't ready to come when the Messiah showed himself. And it continues on with the second part of the parable, which is 11 through 14. And could someone read that? Kathy, you want to read that one?
Okay. All right. So the king then came in to see those who were sitting at table, and he saw there a man who was not wearing a wedding garment. Friend, he said to him, how did you come here with no wedding garment? The man was struck silent. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hands and feet and throw him out into the outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth there. For many are called, but few are chosen. Okay, so how do we fit that in with the grace we were just talking about?
Yeah, that's right. It's like maybe I ought to go get more dressed up and be ready, you know. And Barclay kind of talks about that the Jewish leaders who he's speaking to would have known two basic stories that they would always tell about a king and the garments. And they said one story told of a king who invited the guests to the feast, like we have here, but mentioned that they needed to prepare themselves for when they were summoned. They needed to wash and anoint themselves and clothe themselves so that they would be ready for when they were summoned. And it says the wise went right away and prepared themselves. But the foolish says, hey, this is going to take some time. I know how long it takes to cook a calf or a cow, you know, it would take some time. So they went about their daily tasks. And when the summons came, the wise were ready to come in and eat, and the foolish people had to stand outside. So it's our duty to prepare for the summons of God, and the garments represent the preparations that we make to prepare ourselves for that. He told of another story where a king entrusted his robes to his servants, and the wise carefully stored the robes away, and the foolish wore the robes to work and got them all stained up. And so when they were called, the king, when the king found out about that, he took the robes away and had the foolish service cast into prison. You know, so those were some common stories that the rabbis would tell about a king and his garments. And basically that last one was, we must all hand back our souls to God in their original purity. Those of us with stained souls are condemned. Okay, Barclay says. So what did you kind of get out of this last set of verses? What meaning, what do you think Jesus was trying to teach us?
I guess to treat this invitation of grace with a lot of thankfulness and respect.
Right. Grace is not just a gift, it's a responsibility, is how Barclay says it.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
And
be prepared to give, to return
right.
through that responsibility.
The way that we come into anything demonstrates the spirit that we come to it with. And it says that so it is with God's house. It doesn't mean the clothes we wear, but the spirit in which we go into God's house and how we prepare ourselves to worship.
Mm-hmm. And in Barclay's day, you still wore your best clothes to church on Sunday morning.
I always remember Sylvia always had a hat on.
Mm-hmm.
I loved her hats, you know, and there were a number of people.
What happens if you get called on Thursday?
What?
Well, you're supposed to be dressed and ready to go. And
That's right.
all that.
Well, we're ready to go out to eat anytime.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for my save a date.
You want your refrigerator magnet to come in the mail with.
That's right. When I'm ready to go. Save a date.
So with these three parables that we've just covered from 21 and 22, Jesus has been on the attack with the Orthodox Jewish leaders, these three parables. And so now we have a section where the Jewish leaders launch a counterattack, asking him certain questions. So we'll read 15 through 22 next.
I can do that in Sarah's
Okay.
voice, wish.
Yeah, I don't have a Bible handy. I'm sorry.
That's okay. 15 through 22.
Then the Pharisees came and tried to form a plan to ensnare him in his speech. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are true, and that you teach the way of God in truth, and that you never allow yourself to be swayed by any man. For you are no respecter of persons. Tell us then your opinion. Is it right to pay tribute to Caesar or not? Jesus was well aware of their malice. Hypocrites, he said, why do you try to test me? Show me the tribute coin. They brought him a denarius. Whose image is this? He said to them, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they said to him. Well, then, he said to them, render to Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things which are God's. When they heard this answer, they were amazed and left him and went away.
Okay. We had talked a little bit about the coin, the denarius, a few chapters back, I believe, where Peter was asked why is Jesus going to pay the tax? Remember? And Peter says, oh, sure he is. And then he went to Jesus, and Jesus said, hey, you go out and fish and catch a fish, and the tax will be in the fish's mouth and you can go pay it, type of a thing. So Jesus was paying the tax. Okay. And they said that there were Barclay says there are three different kinds of taxes that Rome regularly had the people pay. One was based on how much grain, a tenth of the grain and a fifth of the oil that you produced, called a ground tax. Another was an income tax, was just 1% of a person's income. But this was what they called the poll tax, or Jesus calls it the tribute coin here, that every male person 12 to 65 had to pay 1 denarius, and it was the usual day's wage for a working man. We had kind of learned that from a previous parable. So the poll tax is the one that Jesus is talking about here. And they were trying to set Jesus up. So what would happen if Jesus said, it's unlawful to pay the tax? What do you think they would have done?
I would have given them ammunition, that he's trying to create all kinds of civil unrest.
Yeah, they could basically report him to the Romans and say, he should be arrested.
Weren't some of the Herodians, it said, so there were some Herodians there too. So I assume.
Yeah. And the Pharisees said they sent their disciples to him along with Herodians. And these are like oil and water people, but they decided they're going to get together to try to trap Jesus, so they come together from their hate of one person. That's enough to get them to come together, to come and ask Jesus this question. So if he said, okay, it is lawful to pay the taxes, what would they have done? What would they have thought?
That it's lawful to pay the taxes?
Yeah. So if Jesus had answered one way or another, if it's unlawful, if he says, oh, it's not lawful, or yeah, it's lawful, what would they have done if it was unlawful? They would have said, well, we're going to turn you over to the Romans because, and have them arrest you because you're seditious. But if it was lawful to pay the taxes, then
then he would have been labeled a Roman sympathizer, and they were an oppressed people.
Yeah, remember, this is written after the temple was destroyed. Matthew was written after. And so even though, if you remember, we studied a little bit further back that up until when the temple was destroyed, this was like a temple tax. This helped pay for running the temple. And after Rome destroyed the temple, Rome still made them pay this tax. And so paying this tax was a problem in Jesus' time, as well as in the early church after the resurrection. So after the temple, Rome demanded it, and they actually used that money for supporting the temple of Jupiter in Rome. And so it was for, one of their temples that the tax was used for. So he would have been discredited in the eyes of many people who really resented the tax for religious reasons. Even though they had to pay it, many people resented that tax. So Jesus was damned if he did and damned if he didn't, no matter how he might answer this question. And that's why he said, you hypocrites, you're trying to trap me. Okay, here. So Jesus it says, Barclay says, Jesus was wise. He asked to see a denarius, and on the denarius, whose head is on there? The emperor's head is on the coin. And coins were, as soon as a new emperor came in, the first thing they did was, I want a coin with my head on it, so it was the kind of the mark of kingship, that people had the coins with your image on it. So he says, whose picture's on here? It was Caesar's. And he says, so give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what is his. So what Barclay says is that Jesus is giving us principles to follow, not rules and regulations. Every Christian has a double citizenship. That first, our citizenship is to God, with, we're a citizen of God's kingdom, but also as people of honor, we are citizens of our country too. So we have like a dual kind of citizenship and responsibilities. And Barclay even quotes 1 Peter chapter 2, where it says, fear God, honor the emperor. And I don't have the context for that written out here right now. So here, as Kathy had mentioned, that this Barclay says you can see the seriousness of this attack when you see who was sent to ask him this question, that the Pharisees and the Herodians were sent, and they came together, two groups that were normally completely opposite. That the Herodians were the party of Herod, king of Galilee, who owed his power to the Romans and worked closely with them, Barclay says. The differences were forgotten here, Barclay says, for the moment, in common hatred for Jesus and a common desire to eliminate him. And so they all came together. But then we end this section with, when they heard his answer, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. Okay, so now here we have the Pharisees, disciples, and the Herodians. Now in the next section, we have another group coming
what was
to
the answer
Jesus.
again? The exact wording of the answer.
He said,
Render unto
whose
Caesar.
picture's on the coin?
Right, but okay.
Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. So give the money to Caesar.
Okay.
Pay the
What
tax.
I'm toying around with here is the word law, because I don't know where in the discussion, and that isn't in the answer, but I'm thinking there's Roman law, and then the Jewish priests and the Jewish religion had 10,000 laws. And then there's esoteric or whatever, God's law. So there are really three kind of laws that are kind of in question, or being considered, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
The main question is just, do they pay the tax? Do they pay the tribute?
Well, but it's deeper than
Is
that,
it right
you
to
know,
pay the imperial tax to
don't
Caesar?
let me overthink this.
yeah, when I've always looked at the Gospels from a helicopter perspective as a big overview, I've always thought that Jesus wasn't here to generate social unrest, political unrest, or to disturb anybody's relationships from the political world. He was here to do moral change, spiritual change, spiritual unrest, to have people believe it, come to learn the new law, versus the old Jewish laws. And I think that this is just one of those cases where he's trying to separate that distinction once again. But there are a number of passages in the Gospels that where the secular world and the spiritual world come together, and that's when he tries to separate them. But I don't think he was trying to generate any social unrest. He was, again, it was more spiritual and moral, and that end.
Oh, we have a puppy coming.
Yeah, I guess along with that, Bernie, to sort of agree with that, love thy neighbor.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean go fight with your neighbor, or all that stuff.
Yeah, and we're going to be ending that chapter with that
Huh.
with that commandment. So, so the Sadducees. What do we know about the Sadducees? Because this next section, the Sadducees are going to be coming to him and asking a question.
Are they the
Isn't that
unhappy people?
The court? Weren't that was the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees were the ones that didn't believe in life after death.
Right. And the Pharisees did. Okay. Okay. So we have the next section is, and Bud, do you want to read that? It's 23 through 31,
All of
right down to here.
okay.
From here to here.
That same day, the sadness.
Sadducees.
Sadness. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and third brother, right on down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Jesus replied, you are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching.
Okay, so the Sadducees now were taking the attack on Jesus. And what Barclay tells us about the Sadducees is that there were not many in number, but they were wealthy, the aristocratic, and the governing class. He said some chief priests were Sadducees. They were quite ready to cooperate with Roman government to retain their own privileges. They were traditionalists, refused to accept oral or scribal law, which the Pharisees held much importance. That the first 5 books of the Old Testament were what they consider binding. They didn't accept the prophets or any of the other books of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and that they completely denied life after death. And the Pharisees, it said, held this life after death as a primary doctrine of the bodily resurrection of the dead. And if they believed that if you didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, that you were shut out from God. So Barclay kind of terms it as, they asked the question which they believe reduced the doctrine of the resurrection of the body to an absurdity. And I thought, this does sound a little absurd. It sounds, if I were reading this, I would think they better get Perot on that wife, because I think the wife's the one's killing all these husbands. But
The first 5 books, isn't that the Torah?
the first 5 books, yeah.
Yeah, Torah is the Hebrew word and Pentateuch is the Greek word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So who will she be? Whose wife will she be of the 7? They're saying. And Jesus says, you got this all wrong, from the start. He says, you're thinking of heaven in terms of earth, that anyone who reads the scripture must see the question is irrelevant, for heaven isn't going to be a continuation of what we have in this world. That it transcends physical relationships and it transcends time. And Barclay adds, if you noticed in this reading, he says, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And it says that in the Sadducees believing in the Torah and only the books of the Torah, God is most often referred to. Instead of saying God, they say, I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob a lot in the Torah. And so
I
it's
think a lot of our Christianity, as I know it, or at least the unction of Christianity, I don't know the right word I want here, but I hear a lot of people say, oh, when I die, I'll be so glad I'll be reunited with my mother and my grandmother and blah, blah, blah. And all these people will be there waiting for me. That's not what that says.
Right. Right. Yeah.
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 It's different. Everything's different.
It's black space.
Well, maybe, I mean, I don't think any of us will be in our human
I'll
form.
be in the Pleiades.
But what Barclay is saying here is that Jesus is basically shattering the Sadducean case that there is no life after death. He's saying, God's not the God of decaying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the God of the living, that they are living. So the living God must be the God of the living. And
So
he
it's
says
almost like he's saying it's not worth your time to try to figure that out.
Mhm. But he says that there was always the Sadducees and the Pharisees were always going back and forth with there's death after, there's bodily resurrection. No, there isn't resurrection, and trying to find places in the Bible that prove one or the other. And Jesus is basically saying here, right, there is, the resurrection is true, and that you all are wrong. And Barclay is saying that there must have been some Pharisees there that were really happy to hear Jesus, say this, that he's proving that there is life after death, but it can't be thought of in the way that we might think of it in earthly terms. So he's kind of taking the Sadducees and stepping on them and rubbing them into the soil a little bit there. And the Pharisees really love that. Okay. And we come next to
Don't these kind of debates still go on? It may not be specific. Well, I think there are within Christianity, these kinds of debates.
I'd say within our church.
That's true. And so, because it comes back to me, the thought comes back to me multiple times, what these things that we can't know, what's the point in spending all of our time, spending time debating and arguing and fighting about them,
Yeah.
I think it's, it's like art, it's subjective, and everybody's going to interpret it how they interpret it. And I guess that's my consideration, is I don't want to be told how to interpret it. And I think that's what the Jewish leaders were doing. They were saying, this is the way it is, and you will believe this, because we know. They're men, they're human.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to Brenny's point about our church or any church or Christianity in general, I'm losing my train of thought here. Never mind.
Welcome to my world.
Oh, Tom and Sarah, y'all have to leave.
Yeah.
We're elders.
What do we do with the
All right.
bread? For a little-
I know.
Okay. Just a second.
All right. I'll see you guys probably in a little bit.
Okay.
I'm right out of the church. All right. Bye.
Okay, I'm going to read the next passage here, the greatest commandment. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And in Matthew, Barclay said that the question looks like another attack on the Pharisees, by saying that another attack on Jesus by the Pharisees, that the Pharisees got together and tested him with this question. But he adds that in Matthew, it's quite different. That in in Mark, it's quite different. And in Mark, what this starts out with is one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? And then Jesus says what he had said previously in Mark. And then afterward, when after he says no commandments it's greater than these, he says, well said, teacher, the man replied, you are right in saying that God is one and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart and with all your understanding and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. So you can see the difference between how this story is told in Matthew than it was in Mark, where the scribe didn't ask the question to trip Jesus up. In Mark, he asked it in gratitude that Jesus had proved the Sadducees to be wrong and to enable Jesus to demonstrate how well he could answer that question, is what Barclay adds to that. And in the end of the passage, the scribe and Jesus are close to each other, or Jesus sees, this man as someone who is wise. Barclay says that here Jesus lays down the definition for religion: to love God and to love those whom God made in his own image. He's quoting here with, it says some of the things that he was quoting was the basic creed of the Jewish service, which Jewish children learn about the love of the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, that type of thing. So.
Time.
Yeah, notice it says that, that's that sentence. Barclay says Jewish services still open with.
Right. We're already at 10:51, so service is going to start. The Zoom service is at 11, I think, 11 o'clock. So we'll have to end. I didn't get the very last passage, but that'll be a good start for next week. Well, they start the thing in turn. But we'll start with that next week.